The countdown light above my head turned red, and every sound in the chamber disappeared at once. I stood barefoot on the cold metal floor of the assessment ring, facing a creature who had trained warriors from 43 worlds and never once been beaten. His name was Corveth Zay, and he stood 2 heads taller than me, with 4 long arms folded behind his back and eyes that shifted color when he was amused. Right now, they were glowing a pale gold. He was amused. 3 seconds, he said, his voice low and smooth, like something that had said the same sentence 1,000 times before. That is more time than any human has ever needed to fail. Take it as a gift, small one. I felt every eye in the observation deck turn toward me. Delegates from a dozen star systems leaned forward behind the reinforced glass, some clicking their mandibles, some tapping notes into floating screens, all of them waiting to watch the newest species in the Interstellar Defense Compact get humbled in front of the galaxy. I did not look at them. I looked at Corveth. 1 second is enough, I said. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a ripple of sound went through the observation deck, something between a laugh and a gasp, the kind of noise a crowd makes when they think they just heard a joke that wasn't funny. Corveth's eyes flickered from gold to a deeper amber. He tilted his head, studying me the way you might study a small animal that had just growled at you. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me the first time," I said. 1 second. I want to explain, before anything else happens, who I am and how I ended up standing in front of a 4-armed alien who had never lost a match in over 300 years of recorded history. My name is Claire Bennett, and 6 months ago, I was a combat instructor at a training facility outside a small coastal town, teaching close-quarters defense to police recruits and athletes who wanted an edge. I never imagined that job would put me in a metal ring on a space station orbiting a planet I couldn't pronounce, staring down a being whose species had been fighting wars since before humans learned to use fire. The Interstellar Defense Compact had discovered Earth 8 months earlier. It was not a friendly first contact. It was closer to an inspection. A dozen alien species arrived in orbit, examined our technology, our history, our conflicts, and delivered a verdict that stung more than any of us expected. Humanity, they said, was intelligent, resourceful, and completely unprepared for the kind of combat that kept peace across a galaxy full of predators smarter than any Earth had ever produced. They offered us membership anyway. Membership came with conditions. One condition was this: every species joining the compact had to send a representative through combat evaluation, to be measured against compact standards and ranked accordingly. It was meant to be humbling. Every species before us had entered that ring with confidence and left with a very different opinion of themselves. I did not know, when I volunteered, that I would be the first human to try. There were rules to this assessment, rules that had been explained to me so many times in briefing rooms that I could recite them in my sleep. The evaluation was not meant to end in serious harm. Every species that entered the ring wore a thin protective layer beneath their clothing, a field that absorbed the worst of any strike and reduced it to something closer to a hard tap than a real blow. The point was never to hurt the candidate. The point was to measure them, to watch how their mind and body responded under pressure, and to record the result for every government in the compact to see. A poor result would not end my life. It would end something else instead, something my captain cared about deeply and something I had come to care about too, over the long months of preparing for this single afternoon. It would end the argument that humanity deserved to be treated as equals instead of guests who needed protecting. I thought about that as I stood there, waiting for Corveth to finish sizing me up. I thought about the recruits I used to train back home, the tired officers who came to my gym after long shifts, convinced they had nothing left to learn, and how satisfying it was to prove them wrong in ways that made them stronger instead of smaller. I thought about the quiet certainty in Captain Hargrove's voice the day he first showed me the footage of Corveth Zay's fights, dozens of them, spanning 3 centuries, and asked me a single question: could I find a pattern in a being who had never lost? I told him I would need time. He gave me 5 months. The observation deck was packed that day, more crowded than any assessment before it, because word had spread that a human was finally being tested. I could see delegates from species I recognized only from briefing photographs, tall insectoid Kesh officials with segmented arms crossed in obvious skepticism, squat gray-skinned Vren officers whispering to each other behind translucent screens, even a pale, silent observer from a species so old that nobody in the room dared address it directly. All of them had come to watch the newest member of their galaxy get measured, and all of them, I was fairly certain, expected the same result they had seen from every other rookie who stepped into this ring for the first time. The room went quiet again as Corvith studied me. Behind the glass, I could see Captain Daniel Hargrove, the man who had recruited me for this program, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He had told me before I walked in here that I did not have to say anything clever. I only had to survive the assessment without embarrassing our species too badly. That had been his exact phrase, not embarrassing us too badly. I had smiled at him then, and I smiled now, thinking about it. "You misunderstand the purpose of this exercise," Corvith said, unfolding his upper arms and letting them hang loose at his sides, a posture I already recognized from the training footage I had studied for months. It was the posture he used right before he moved. "This is not a contest of wit. Humans like to speak. It is, I have noticed, the thing your species does best. But confidence does not change reaction time. It does not change reflexes built over millions of years of evolution that your species has not had the luxury of experiencing. I could disarm you before your mind finished registering that I had moved." "You could try," I said. Another sound rippled through the crowd, sharper this time. Somewhere behind the glass, I heard what might have been a growl of irritation from one of the observing delegates, a tall insectoid being, from a species that considered human bluntness close to an insult. I did not care. I had spent the last 5 months preparing for exactly this moment, and I was not going to waste it being polite. Corvith's eyes narrowed, the gold draining out of them, replaced by something colder. "You are either the bravest human I have met," he said, "or the least informed. I have fought champions from the Vren homeworld who trained from birth for combat glory, and they needed the full 3 seconds simply to raise their weapon. I have fought soldiers from the Kesh Alliance whose bodies process information 4 times faster than yours. None of them spoke the way you are speaking now." "Maybe they were wrong to be quiet," I said. I watched something shift in his expression, a flicker of genuine curiosity breaking through the amusement, like he was seeing me for the first time instead of simply seeing another creature to be measured and dismissed. It was a small thing, but I noticed it, because noticing small things was the entire reason I was standing in that ring instead of some other cadet. He raised one of his 4 hands, and a soft chime rang out through the chamber, a signal that the official countdown was about to begin. Above us, the number 3 appeared in bright red light, then held there, waiting. 3 seconds, he said again, quieter now, almost to himself. "Let us see what a human considers enough." I did not answer him with words this time. I settled my weight evenly across both feet, the way I had trained myself to stand 1,000 times before, in a gym with gray walls and no windows, sweating through drills that had nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with making my body respond faster than my mind could think. I let my hands fall loose at my sides, the same posture Corvith had taken a moment earlier, though I doubted he noticed I had mirrored him on purpose. Behind the glass, I could feel Captain Hargrove holding his breath. I could feel the weight of every alien eye in that observation deck, waiting to see the newest species in their galaxy fall exactly the way they expected us to fall. I was not thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about the year that had led me here, the quiet mornings and long nights, and the strange, secret program that had chosen me out of thousands of qualified candidates for reasons I would not fully understand until the countdown light turned green. Corvith shifted his stance, 4 arms rising slightly, each hand curling into a ready position that I recognized from hours of recorded footage. a stance his species called the opening bloom, designed to look relaxed while hiding the exact angle of his first movement. I had studied that stance more times than I could count. I had asked myself over and over, in the quiet hours before this day, whether studying it would be enough. The chime sounded again. The red number above us flickered. 3. I exhaled slowly, feeling my heartbeat settle into a rhythm I had trained for years to control, a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with readiness. 2. Corvith's eyes locked onto mine, and for just a moment I saw something there that no amount of confidence on his part could hide. It was not fear, not yet, but it was the beginning of doubt, the first crack in 300 years of certainty. 1. The light turned green, and the chamber erupted into motion. 5 months earlier, I was sitting in a windowless briefing room on a military base I am still not allowed to name, watching Captain Daniel Hargrove replay the same piece of footage for the 6th time in a row. It showed Corvith Zay standing in a ring almost identical to the one I would eventually stand in myself, facing a Vren champion twice his width, all muscle and armored plating, a warrior bred and trained from childhood for exactly this kind of contest. The champion moved first. He always moved first. Every recording showed that. Every alien challenger threw the first strike because they believed speed was the only thing that mattered. Corvith let him come. Then, in a blur that the recording had to slow down to even show clearly, Corvith stepped half a pace to the side, caught the champion's arm at the wrist, and turned the entire fight into stillness. The champion was on the ground before the countdown timer even reached 0. "He does this every time," Hargrove said, pausing the footage on Corvith's calm, unreadable face. "Different species, different weapons, different fighting styles. He waits, he reads the first movement, and he ends it before his opponent understands what happened. Nobody has cracked the pattern, not in 300 years. "Then maybe there isn't one to crack," I said. "Maybe he's just better than everyone who has faced him." "Maybe," Hargrove said, "or maybe nobody who faced him thought the way you do." That was the moment the program truly began for me, though I did not understand the full scope of it until much later. Hargrove explained that the Compact's assessment protocol was not simply a formality. It shaped how every species was treated afterward, what technology they were trusted with, what territories they were allowed to settle, even what protections they received if conflict broke out somewhere in Compact space. Humanity's first impression mattered more than any diplomat's speech, because Corvith Zay's evaluation ring was the one place the entire galaxy actually paid attention. I was given full access to every recorded match Corvith had ever fought, over 400 hours of footage collected by observers from a dozen different worlds, most of it never shown outside Compact archives. I watched it during the day, alone, freezing frames, sketching angles, timing his reactions down to fractions of a second using equipment normally reserved for professional sports analysis. At night, I trained. The gym they built for me was nothing like the one I had worked in back home. It had reactive lighting that flashed unpredictable colors to sharpen peripheral vision, weighted floor panels that shifted slightly underfoot to simulate uneven terrain, and a small team of retired athletes and combat scientists who treated my training like a puzzle they were determined to solve alongside me. A woman named Grace Whitmore, a former Olympic fencer with a mind for patterns sharper than anyone I had ever met, became the person I worked with most closely. She was the one who first noticed something the rest of the team had missed. "He never reacts to what you do," Grace told me one evening, replaying a match on the screen between us, her finger tapping the glass at the exact instant Corvith moved. "He reacts to what he predicts you will do next. Watch his weight. It shifts before his opponent even finishes their first motion. He is not fast. He is early." That single sentence changed everything about how I trained. If Corvith's advantage came from predicting an opponent's next move based on the first one, then the way to beat him was not to be faster. It was to be less predictable. Every species he had ever faced moved according to instinct, shaped by millions of years of evolution. Instinct so deeply built into their bodies that Corvith could read the first half-second of any strike and know exactly where the rest of it was going. Humans had instincts too, shaped by our own long history, but we also had something most of those species lacked in equal measure. We had the ability to consciously override instinct in the middle of a decision, to choose an action that felt wrong to our own bodies simply because we understood, intellectually, that it would work. Grace built an entire training program around that idea. We spent weeks on nothing but broken rhythm drills, movements designed to start in one direction and shift halfway through, forcing my brain to interrupt its own momentum on command. It was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with muscle fatigue. It felt like trying to walk while thinking about every single step, except the goal was the opposite, to make the interruption so practiced that it became just as automatic as the instinct it was replacing. There was a night, about 2 months into training, when I nearly quit. I had spent 6 straight hours failing the same drill, unable to break my own habitual reactions no matter how many times Grace reset the exercise. I sat on the floor of that strange, colorful gym, soaked in sweat, and told her I did not think a human body could do what she was asking it to do. "You are not fighting your body," she said, sitting down across from me, her voice calm in a way that annoyed me at the time and comforted me later. "You are fighting 300 years of a story other species have told themselves. Corvith has beaten everyone because everyone before you believed he was unbeatable before they even stepped into that ring. Belief changes the body faster than any drill I can design. If you walk in there convinced you are early, not fast, you will already be standing on ground he has never faced before." I did not fully believe her that night, but I got back up and we ran the drill again and again until something in my body finally stopped resisting the interruption and simply accepted it as another kind of instinct. It took another 3 weeks after that before I could break rhythm reliably, without thinking about it, the same way I might once have thrown a straight punch without thinking about it. The final piece of preparation came from a source I did not expect. 2 weeks before the assessment, Hargrove brought in a young compact liaison named Nathan Price, a soft-spoken data analyst who had spent years studying reaction times across different species for an entirely different purpose, something related to trade negotiations rather than combat. Nathan showed us data nobody on our team had considered, detailed timing charts comparing average nerve conduction speeds across a dozen compact species. Humans were not the fastest. We were not close to the fastest. But our timing data had an unusual amount of variation, a wider spread than any other species in the charts, wider even than species famous for unpredictable behavior. "Your species is inconsistent," Nathan said, and he meant it as a compliment, though it did not sound like one at first. "Every other species in these charts reacts within a narrow, predictable window every single time. Humans do not. Sometimes you are slow. Sometimes you are faster than anyone expects. The variation itself is the advantage, if you can learn to control when the fast reaction happens instead of leaving it to chance." That was the final month of my training, learning to summon that fast, unpredictable edge of human reaction time on command instead of by accident, learning to recognize the exact mental state that produced it and to trigger that state deliberately, under pressure, in front of an audience. Grace called it finding my 1 second. I did not fully understand what she meant until the night before the assessment, lying awake in a small quarters aboard the station where the evaluation would take place, running through Corvith's movements in my mind one final time and feeling, for the first time since the training began, something that was not quite confidence and not quite calm, but close enough to both that I finally managed to sleep. People often asked me, during those 5 months, why I had volunteered for something so strange when so many other qualified candidates were available. The truthful answer was smaller and simpler than anyone expected. My younger brother, Ethan, had joined the first group of human engineers sent to study compact ship technology, and during his second week aboard a compact vessel, a minor dispute broke out between his escort team and a group of Kesh officers who considered humans too fragile to be trusted near sensitive equipment. Nobody was seriously hurt, but Ethan came home describing the encounter with a kind of quiet humiliation I had never heard in his voice before. The sense of being dismissed, not because of anything he had done, but simply because of what he was. When Hargrove came looking for volunteers a month later, I thought of Ethan's voice on that call, and I said yes before he finished explaining what the assignment would involve. Grace understood that reason better than most people on the team, because she carried a similar one of her own. She had represented her country in fencing for over a decade, only to watch her sport quietly dismissed by commentators who preferred faster, louder events. And she recognized in my situation an old, familiar shape, the frustration of being underestimated by people who had never bothered to look closely enough to understand what they were watching. She pushed me harder than anyone else on the team, not out of cruelty, but because she refused to let the compact's assumptions become true simply through lack of effort on our part. Roughly 6 weeks before the assessment, Nathan Price's data team built something they called a reactive shadow, a simulated combat partner projected through the same reactive lighting system in my gym, programmed using every recorded fragment of Corveth's movement patterns. It was not truly him, only a rough imitation built from partial data, but it moved with enough of his signature timing to give me something real to practice against instead of imagination alone. The first time I faced the shadow, it ended the simulated exchange in under a second, exactly as the recordings predicted, and I remember standing there afterward, feeling the full weight of 300 years of undefeated history, for the first time in a way that statistics on a screen had never managed to convey. I faced that shadow more than 200 times over the following weeks. The first 50 attempts ended almost identically, a blur of motion followed by a soft chime indicating defeat. Somewhere around attempt 60, I began noticing details the earlier failures had hidden from me, small tells in the shadow's stance that repeated every single time, tiny shifts in weight distribution that appeared a fraction of a second before any visible movement. By attempt 100, I could delay the shadow's decisive strike by half a second simply by refusing to commit to an obvious first movement of my own. By attempt 150, I had won 3 exchanges outright, each time by breaking the rhythm exactly the way Grace had trained me to, choosing a movement my body did not want to make, simply because I understood it would work. The 200th attempt ended differently from every one before it. I do not remember deciding to move. Grace told me afterward that something in my stance changed half a second before the shadow committed to its strike, and that whatever I did next happened too quickly for the recording equipment to capture cleanly, requiring 3 separate frame-by-frame reviews before her team could reconstruct exactly what had occurred. I only remember the chime sounding in a different tone than usual, a tone the system used only when the exercise ended in the trainee's favor, and Grace's quiet, stunned silence afterward. The first time in 5 months I had seen her, without an immediate correction or note ready to offer. "That is what 1 second looks like," she said finally. "Do that again, and do it in front of people who do not expect it, and I do not think Corveth Zay has ever seen anything like it in 300 years of fighting." I trained the same reaction another 40 times after that night, refining it, making certain it was not luck, but something closer to a skill I could summon deliberately. Nathan's team ran the data through every model they had, comparing my results against every species in the compact archive, and the number that came back settled something in me that no amount of encouragement from Hargrove or Grace ever could. Under the right conditions, given a fully committed first movement from an opponent who believed speed alone would win, a trained human body could interrupt and respond within a single second, faster than the reaction window any compact species had ever recorded, precisely because our nervous systems were built for adaptability instead of raw, consistent speed. I woke early the next morning, to Captain Hargrove's voice over the comm, telling me it was time. I dressed in silence, walked the long gray corridor toward the assessment chamber, with Grace's last words echoing in my mind, and stepped through the door into a room full of aliens who had already decided how this would end. They were wrong, and some small, quiet part of me had known it for weeks. The green light flooded the chamber, and time did something I had only ever felt once before, during that 200th attempt against the reactive shadow in a gym half a galaxy away. Corveth moved first. He always moved first. The recordings had shown that in every one of his 300 years of matches, and some part of me had wondered, even after everything Grace and Nathan had taught me, whether he might break that pattern the moment it actually mattered. He did not. His upper right arm shifted forward in a strike aimed at my shoulder, a strike designed to end the exchange before I had time to register it as a real threat, exactly the way it had ended every challenge before mine. But I was not watching his arm. Grace had drilled that lesson into me so many times that it had become the very first thing my mind did the instant any confrontation began. I was watching his weight. It shifted a fraction of a second before his arm moved, the smallest transfer of balance toward his back leg, a tell so small that the recording equipment back home had needed to be slowed down to a crawl before anyone could see it clearly. In the chamber, with my own eyes, unaided by any screen or slow-motion replay, I saw it happen in real time, and something in me that had been trained for months longer than I had consciously understood simply took over. I did not step back. Stepping back was the obvious response, the instinctive response, the response every predator species in that observation deck expected from a smaller, weaker-looking creature facing a much larger opponent. Grace's broken rhythm drills existed for exactly this moment, to override the instinct that told me to retreat and replace it with something Corveth's centuries of experience had never once had to account for. I stepped forward and to the side, inside the arc of his strike, instead of away from it, closing the distance he had built his entire fighting style around maintaining. His arm passed through the space where my shoulder had been a heartbeat earlier, and for the first time in 300 years, Corveth Zay's opening strike found nothing but empty air. I felt his second arm begin to move, a follow-up strike his body had launched automatically, the kind of layered attack that had ended every previous challenge within the second strike if the first one somehow failed. But a follow-up strike depends on knowing where your opponent has gone, and I was no longer standing where his training told him a retreating opponent would be. I was already inside the reach of his upper body, closer to him than any challenger had ever managed to get in the opening exchange. Close enough that his long arms, built for striking at range, had become a disadvantage instead of a weapon. My hand closed around his wrist, the same wrist that had ended a Vren champion twice his size in the footage Hargrove had shown me on my very first day of training. I did not try to overpower him. I had never been the strongest person in any room I had ever trained in, and I was certainly not the strongest being in that chamber. Strength had never been the plan. Leverage was the plan, the same principle Corveth himself had used against every opponent who had ever faced him, turned back against the one being who had never expected to feel it applied to himself. I redirected the momentum of his own strike, using the forward motion his body had already committed to, guiding his arm past me instead of stopping it, letting his own speed and weight do the work that my strength alone never could. His balance, already shifted toward his back leg in preparation for a strike that never found its target, had nowhere left to recover to. For the first time in 300 years of recorded matches, Corveth Zay's stance broke. He was still fast. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though he simply stood still and let me win, and that is not what happened. Even off balance, even caught by a movement his instincts had never encountered before, his lower arms were already reacting, reaching to stabilize himself, to recover the half-second he had just lost. A being with 300 years of undefeated combat experience does not simply fall over because one predicted strike missed its mark. He fought the loss of balance with everything his body had spent centuries perfecting. But recovery takes time, even for someone as skilled as Corvith Zay, and time was the one resource I had trained 5 months to steal from him. I used his own turning motion to guide him further, my other hand finding his lower arm before it could complete its stabilizing reach, applying just enough additional pressure at exactly the angle his own momentum had already created. It was not a powerful movement. It did not need to be powerful. It needed only to arrive at precisely the moment his balance was already failing, adding the smallest possible push in the direction his body was already falling toward. In that fraction of a second, with his balance already failing and his lower arms scrambling to recover, ground his body had never before needed to recover, I became aware of details I had not expected to notice at all. I remember the faint hum of the chamber's protective field, a sound too quiet to hear under normal circumstances, but somehow audible now, stretched out across whatever strange, elastic version of time my training had unlocked. I remember the exact texture of his wrist beneath my grip, cooler than human skin, covered in something between scale and fabric that shifted slightly as his muscles fought to reverse what was already happening. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even as it occurred, that Grace had been right about everything. That belief truly did change the body faster than any drill could, because in that instant I did not feel like someone attempting the impossible. I felt like someone finishing a movement I had already practiced 240 times before. Behind the reinforced glass, I later learned, the observation deck had its own version of that same frozen moment. Captain Hargrove told me afterward that the tall insectoid Kesh officials, the ones who had crossed their segmented arms in open skepticism before the countdown began, had gone completely still the instant Corvith's first strike missed its target, their species apparently reading stillness itself as a sign of genuine alarm rather than calm. The squat gray Vren officers, whose own champion had needed the full 3 seconds against Corvith just to raise a weapon, reportedly rose halfway out of their seats, some kind of low, rapid clicking passing between them that the station's translation systems struggled to render into any human-sounding words at all. Even the pale, ancient observer that nobody in the room had dared address directly was said to have leaned forward against the glass, the first movement anyone present could recall it making in over a decade of attending these assessments. None of them, I was later told, expected what happened next any more than Corvith himself did. His lower arms found purchase against the smooth floor a half-breath too late, his weight already committed too far past the point where his own considerable skill could pull it back, and in that final, stretched-out sliver of time, I understood with total certainty that Grace's number, 0.9 seconds, was no longer a target I was chasing. It was already behind me, already finished, already the new shape of what had just become true in front of an audience representing every corner of compact space. Corvith Zay, undefeated instructor to 43 worlds, went down. He did not fall hard. The protective systems built into the chamber floor cushioned his landing the same way they would have cushioned mine if our positions had been reversed, and within a heartbeat he was already pushing himself back up onto one knee, his forearms braced against the floor, his eyes wide in an expression I did not yet have enough experience with his species to fully read. But the countdown timer above us had already stopped. The chamber's systems, built to recognize the exact moment an assessment ended in a clear result, had registered the fall and frozen the display the instant his balance failed completely. The number on the screen read 0.9 seconds. I stood there, breathing steadily, my hands still loosely extended from the motion that had just ended 3 centuries of certainty, and I watched the observation deck behind the reinforced glass go completely, utterly silent. Not the amused silence from before the countdown began. Something closer to shock, the kind of silence that comes when a room full of intelligent, experienced observers realizes that everything they believed about the universe a few seconds earlier is no longer true. Corvith remained on one knee for a long moment, his forearms still braced against the floor, his gold eyes fixed on me with an expression that had nothing left of the amusement he wore when the countdown began. I did not move toward him. I did not offer a hand, uncertain whether that gesture would translate correctly across our two very different cultures, uncertain whether it would be read as respect or as another kind of insult. I simply stood and waited and let him take whatever time he needed to process what had just happened to him. Somewhere behind the glass, I heard Captain Hargrove's voice, quiet but carrying clearly through the sudden silence of the observation deck, saying a single word that I would hear repeated many times over the following weeks, in briefings, in reports, in messages sent to every government in the compact. 0.9, he said, and I could hear, even through the glass, the disbelief threaded through his own voice. A man who had spent 5 months building toward this exact moment and still could not quite accept that it had actually happened. Corveth Zay rose slowly to his full height, taller than me by a full head even now, his 4 arms settling back into a stillness I had never seen him hold before, not once in over 400 hours of recorded footage. He studied me for a long moment, his expression shifting through something I could not immediately name, something between disbelief and a kind of careful, deliberate recalculation, as though every assumption his mind had built over 3 centuries was being quietly, methodically rebuilt from nothing. "You broke rhythm," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been at any point since I entered the chamber. "Deliberately, you saw the shift in my weight, and you chose the one response my strike could not account for." "Yes," I said. "No species has ever done that, against my opening movement," he said. "Not once, in 300 years. Then maybe you were only ever fighting species that thought the same way you did," I said. "We don't." He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him glance toward the frozen number still glowing above the ring, 0.9, as though checking a second time that his own eyes had not deceived him. 300 years of matches lived somewhere behind that gaze, I knew, and I did not think it was an easy thing for any being to have the foundation of 3 centuries shift beneath their feet in under a single second. "I built my entire method on a simple assumption," he said, more to himself than to me, though his eyes never left mine, "that any creature capable of complex thought would, under sudden pressure, default to instinct. Instinct is honest. Instinct does not lie about what a body intends to do next. I have read that honesty in every species I have ever faced, and it has never once failed me." "It didn't fail you this time either," I said. "You read my instinct perfectly. My instinct told me to step back. I just didn't listen to it." Something in his posture changed then, a slight straightening through all 4 shoulders that I would later learn, from Nathan's cultural briefings, was the closest his species came to something like a human's held breath. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that you felt the correct impulse, the one every predator alive would recognize as fear, responding correctly to danger, and you overruled it deliberately, in the single second where overruling it mattered most." "Yes," I said. "That should not be possible under this much pressure," he said. "Conscious override requires processing time that fear responses are specifically designed to bypass. I have tested this principle across 43 worlds." "Then maybe 43 worlds wasn't enough," I said, and I did not say it to wound him. I said it because it was, as far as 5 months of training and 240 repetitions against a rough imitation of his own fighting style had taught me, simply true. Corveth studied me a moment longer, and something passed behind his eyes that I would only fully understand much later, once I came to know him better, a kind of quiet, disciplined excitement that his centuries of composure did not allow him to show openly in front of an audience still watching through the glass. Whatever else he was feeling in that moment, shock, humility, the particular discomfort of having a lifelong certainty rewritten in front of an audience of his peers, I could see that some deeper part of him, the part that had chosen to spend 300 years teaching rather than simply fighting, was already turning this defeat into something he wanted very badly to understand. The observation deck remained silent behind the glass, A dozen species from a dozen different worlds staring at a scene none of them had any framework to properly understand, and somewhere in that silence, I felt something shift that went far beyond the outcome of a single assessment match. I felt, for the first time since Hargrove first showed me that footage 5 months earlier, that the entire conversation about what humanity was and what humanity could become had just been rewritten in front of an audience that would never be able to unsee it. Corvith Zay looked down at his own hands for a long moment, then back at me, and for the first time since I had walked into that chamber, his 4 arms did not look like they belonged to a being who had never lost. They looked, briefly, like they belonged to someone who was genuinely, deeply curious about what he had just witnessed, and what it might mean for every assumption he had carried through 3 centuries of undefeated history. The doors to the observation deck opened faster than protocol usually allowed, and Captain Daniel Hargrove was the first person through them, walking quickly across the chamber floor with an expression I had never seen him wear in 5 months of working together. Something between disbelief and a kind of relief, so complete it looked almost like grief. He stopped a few paces from me, glanced once at Corvith, who was still standing near the center of the ring, studying the frozen number above us, and then looked back at me as though checking that I was actually real. 0.9 seconds, he said again, quieter this time, the words clearly still settling into something he could accept as true. Claire, do you understand what you just did in there? I think so, I said. I think I did exactly what we spent 5 months preparing for. You did more than that, he said. You did it in front of every delegate the compact sent to observe this assessment. There is no way to quietly file this result away. Every government represented in that observation deck just watched their entire model of human capability collapse in under a second. Behind him, the observation deck was no longer silent. I could hear voices rising through the glass, overlapping in languages the station's translation systems were struggling to keep pace with. A dozen species processing what they had just witnessed in a dozen different ways. Some of it sounded like argument. Some of it sounded, unmistakably, like fear. Corvith Zay approached us slowly, his 4 arms now hanging loose at his sides, in a posture I recognized from the footage as something closer to genuine calm than the deceptive stillness he had worn before the countdown began. He stopped a respectful distance away and inclined his head slightly, a gesture Hargrove had once told me was reserved, among his species, for addressing someone whose skill demanded acknowledgement rather than simple politeness. I would like to request something unusual, Corvith said, addressing both of us, though his eyes remained fixed on me. A private session, away from the observation deck and away from official record, where I might ask you questions that I do not believe are appropriate to explore in front of an audience still deciding how frightened they should be of what they just witnessed. Hargrove glanced at me, and I nodded, and the 3 of us moved through a side door into a smaller chamber, quieter and dimmer than the assessment ring, with none of the reinforced glass or observing crowds that had surrounded us moments earlier. Corvith sat, or folded himself into something like sitting, on a low bench built for a body shaped very differently from his own, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply studying his own 4 hands as though they belonged to someone he was only now beginning to fully understand. In 300 years, he said finally, I have trained species that possess reflexes 10 times faster than yours. Technology that reads intention before the body itself commits to it. Physical strength that could end this conversation before either of us finished a single sentence. I dismissed your species during our briefing 3 days ago, Captain Hargrove, and I want to be honest about that dismissal now, because I believe honesty is the only path forward from what just occurred. I told the observation committee that humanity would need the full 3 seconds, likely all 3, and would still fail to produce a meaningful result. I based that assessment on your species' recorded reaction times, your relatively short evolutionary history compared to most compact members, and the absence of any specialized combat physiology in your biology. You weren't wrong about the biology, I said. We really are slower, on average, than most of the species you've trained. Our reflexes aren't special. Our bodies aren't built for this the way a Vren champion's body is built for it. Then explain to me, Corveth said, leaning forward slightly, what I just experienced in that ring, because every measurement available to me insists it should not have been possible. I thought about how to answer that honestly, without dressing it up in more confidence than the truth actually supported, because I understood, even then, that whatever I said in this small quiet room would likely shape how his species understood mine for a very long time afterward. You train based on an assumption that instinct is honest, I said, echoing what Grace had told me in that colorful gym half a galaxy away. You're right about that for almost every species you've faced. Instinct is honest, and fast, and reliable, because it's been refined by millions of years of evolution to keep a body alive without needing to think first. Humans have instinct too. We're not exempt from it. But somewhere in our own long history, something else developed alongside it. The ability to notice our own instinct in the moment it's happening and consciously choose something different, even when that choice feels wrong to every fiber of our body telling us otherwise. It's not faster than instinct. It's not more reliable than instinct. Most of the time, honestly, it's worse than instinct, because overriding a correct impulse in a dangerous moment usually gets people hurt rather than helping them. But it means we're not predictable the way instinct alone would make us predictable, and you've spent 300 years reading instinct so well that you never had to develop a method for reading something like conscious override, because nobody you'd faced needed to use it against you before. Corveth was silent for a long moment, and I watched something settle behind his eyes, the particular stillness of someone recalculating an idea they had trusted completely for a very long time. Grace Whitmore, he said eventually. The trainer, Captain Hargrove, mentioned in the assessment briefing. She identified this. She noticed you predict rather than react, I said. Everything else came from building a way to make that prediction fail. I would like to meet her, Corveth said, not to challenge her methods, to understand them properly from someone who built the theory rather than only executed it. Hargrove, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke. That can be arranged, he said, though I suspect, Instructor Zay, that you understand what a meeting like that would signal to the rest of the compact. If you begin studying human training methods openly, it changes how every other delegation views this result. I am aware, Corveth said, and something in his tone suggested he had already fully considered that consequence and accepted it regardless. I did not spend 300 years teaching because I valued being undefeated. I valued understanding combat more completely than anyone else who attempted to study it. A method that can produce what I witnessed today deserves study, regardless of what conclusions the wider compact draws from my willingness to study it. I sat with that for a moment, watching this being who had entered the assessment chamber a few hours earlier, utterly certain of his own superiority, now sitting across from me speaking with what sounded, unmistakably, like genuine respect. It was not the outcome I had expected when Hargrove first showed me that footage 5 months earlier. I had expected, at best, to survive the assessment without embarrassing my species too badly, exactly the low bar Hargrove himself had set before I walked into that ring. I had not expected the undefeated instructor of 43 worlds to be sitting across from me, quietly rebuilding 300 years of certainty in real time. There is something else, Corveth said, after a pause, long enough that I thought our conversation had reached its natural end. The observation committee will want an official ruling on your assessment result. Given the outcome, I am required to submit a formal recommendation regarding humanity's combat classification within the compact. I want you to understand, before I submit it, what that recommendation will say. Tell me, I said. I intend to recommend that humanity be reclassified from a species requiring protective oversight to a species eligible for combat training partnership, he said. It is a designation only 6 species in the compact currently hold. It will not be a popular recommendation among every delegation that watched today's assessment. Some will argue I have been embarrassed into overcorrecting. Others will argue, more usefully I think, that a species this new to compact contact should not yet be trusted with a designation that carries real influence over shared defense strategy. "What do you think?" I asked. Corveth considered the question seriously, the way I imagined he considered every question that had ever mattered to him across 3 centuries of teaching. "I think," he said finally, "that I trained for 300 years believing I understood the full landscape of how intelligent beings respond to danger. I met you this afternoon, and in less than 1 second I learned that the landscape was larger than I believed it to be. I do not think that lesson should be quietly dismissed, simply because it is uncomfortable for those who observed it. I think it should be studied, carefully, by anyone in the compact who claims to care about understanding combat rather than simply winning it." We left that quiet room a short while later, and the corridor outside was busier than I had ever seen it. Station personnel and compact aides moving in both directions with the particular urgency of people who had just watched something happen that their morning schedules had not accounted for. A young Kesh aide, one of the segmented armed officials who had crossed her arms in open skepticism before the assessment began, stopped briefly as we passed and inclined her head toward me in a gesture I did not yet recognize, though Hargrove later told me it was a formal sign of respect rarely extended to outsiders on their first meeting. I found a quiet corner near the observation deck's outer corridor and used my personal comm to call Grace, who answered before the second ring finished, her voice already tight with anticipation. "Tell me," she said, without any greeting at all. 0.9, I said. There was a pause on the line long enough that I checked whether the connection had dropped, and then I heard something I had never once heard from Grace Whitmore in 5 months of training together. A short, sharp laugh followed immediately by something that sounded suspiciously close to a held-back sob. "I need you to say that number again," she said, slowly. 0.9 seconds, I said. "He wants to meet you. Corveth Zay himself. He wants to understand the training method, not just the result." "Good," Grace said, her voice steadying quickly into something closer to her familiar focused tone, "because the result without the method is just a story people will doubt in a year. The method is what actually changes anything." I told her everything, standing in that busy corridor while station personnel moved around me, the broken rhythm, the weight shift, the 240 repetitions against the reactive shadow that had finally taught my body to recognize the exact moment worth overriding instinct for. Grace listened without interrupting, the way she always had during our long training sessions, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You know this changes things beyond just you," she said. "Every cadet who goes through compact assessment after this is going to be measured against what you just did. That's not a small weight to leave behind you." "I know," I said, and I found, standing there in that busy corridor with the sound of a dozen alien languages still echoing faintly from the observation deck behind me, that the weight did not feel heavy the way I might have expected. It felt, instead, like the shape of something I had spent 5 months building toward without fully realizing how large it would eventually become. Hargrove found me again a short while later, his expression calmer now than it had been in the assessment chamber, though something in his posture told me the day's work was far from finished. "The full committee wants a formal statement from you," he said. "Not today. They need time to process the recommendation Corveth intends to submit. And frankly, Claire, so do I. But this is only the beginning of what today's result is going to mean, for you personally and for every human who comes after you into compact space. I didn't do this so it would mean something for every human who comes after me," I said. "I did it because Ethan came home sounding like someone who had been told, without anyone actually saying the words, that he didn't matter as much as the people standing next to him." "I know," Hargrove said, "but it's going to mean that anyway, whether either of us intended it or not." I did not have an answer for that, not yet. Standing in a busy corridor, on a station orbiting a planet I still could not properly pronounce, still feeling the last traces of adrenaline fading slowly from a body that had, less than an hour earlier, broken 300 years of certainty in less time than it takes to draw a single full breath. 3 weeks after the assessment, I sat in a small office aboard the same station, reading a summary report that Nathan Price's team had compiled from data across 19 different compact worlds, and I understood, for the first time in concrete numbers rather than second-hand impressions, exactly how far the ripple from that single second had already traveled. Corvith Zay's formal recommendation had been accepted by the assessment committee 12 days after our conversation in that small dim room, though not without the resistance he had predicted. 2 delegations, including the Kesh representatives who had watched the assessment with such open skepticism, formally objected to the reclassification, arguing that a single result, however striking, should not overturn decades of established compact protocol regarding a newly contacted species. Their objection was noted, debated for several days in committee sessions I was not permitted to attend, and ultimately overruled by a majority that included, somewhat to Hargrove's visible surprise, 3 delegations that had never previously supported any measure favorable to humanity. Humanity was reclassified as a species eligible for combat training partnership, one of only 7 such species in the entire compact, joining a short list that included the Vren, whose champion had needed the full 3 seconds against Corvith and never forgot it, and 2 other species I had never even heard of before that report crossed my desk. The reclassification carried practical consequences that unfolded faster than anyone on our team had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, formal requests arrived from 4 separate compact worlds asking whether human combat instructors might be made available for training exchange programs, official language for what several of Nathan's contacts described, less formally, as an urgent scramble among smaller compact species to understand a training philosophy that had just embarrassed one of the galaxy's most respected instructors. Grace received the first of those invitations personally, a request from a modest but well-regarded training academy on a world called Ithera, asking whether she might be willing to conduct a series of guest sessions on what their letter referred to, somewhat clumsily translated, as adaptive instinct interruption. She called me the night the invitation arrived, her voice carrying an excitement I recognized instantly, because it was the same excitement I had heard in her voice the night I finally broke 200 repetitions against the reactive shadow. "They want to know how you did it," she said. "Not just what happened, the actual mechanism. Do you understand what that means? A species that has been quietly running combat training programs since before humans figured out written language wants to sit down and learn something from us." "It means Nathan's data was right," I said. "The variation really was the advantage, once someone learned to aim it." "It means more than that," Grace said. "It means the story the compact told about themselves, the one where older species have already learned everything worth learning about how minds and bodies respond to danger, was never entirely true. There was a gap in that story. You found it. Corvith Zay, true to his word, requested a series of private sessions with Grace over the following 2 months, conducted remotely at first through recorded exchanges and detailed data comparisons, and later in person when Grace traveled to the station to meet him directly. I was present for parts of that first in-person meeting, and I watched 2 people who had spent their respective careers studying the same subject from entirely different angles slowly discover how much each of them had to teach the other. Corvith, for his part, brought centuries of pattern recognition, an almost encyclopedic understanding of how instinct manifested differently across dozens of species. Grace brought something he had never fully accounted for in 300 years of teaching, a working theory of how a mind could consciously interrupt its own most deeply trained impulses under real pressure, built not from ancient tradition, but from careful, modern, iterative experimentation. I spent 3 centuries believing instinct was the final layer of any combat response, Corvith told me, during a quiet moment near the end of that visit. watching Grace review data with two of his own senior students in an adjoining room. I now understand it is simply the layer most species never learn to look past. Your species found a way past it, almost by accident, through a history too short and too strange for evolution to fully optimize you, the way it optimized everyone else I have trained. I do not think that is a weakness, Claire. I think, given enough time, it may prove to be one of the more interesting advantages any species has brought into this compact in a very long while. I thought about that conversation often over the following months, as the practical consequences of that single second continued to unfold in ways none of us on the original training team had fully anticipated. Human instructors, drawn from a growing pool of candidates who volunteered once the reclassification made such postings possible, began appearing in modest training programs across small pockets of compact space, teaching broken rhythm techniques and conscious override drills to species who had spent generations assuming their evolutionary inheritance had already given them every advantage available. Not every program succeeded immediately. Grace was honest about that in every report she filed, careful never to overstate how quickly other species could adapt a method built specifically around a particular quirk of human neurology. But enough programs showed genuine, measurable improvement that requests kept arriving, steadily, from compact worlds that had never previously shown any interest in human capability at all. Captain Hargrove was reassigned 6 months after the assessment to lead a new division within the Compact Liaison Office, one created specifically to manage the growing exchange of training expertise between human instructors and compact worlds. He asked me, before he left our original posting, whether I wanted to join him in that new division, and I found myself considering the question far more carefully than I expected to. "You don't have to decide today," he said, "but I want you to think about something before you do decide. That assessment chamber, the one where you faced Corvith, gets used almost weekly now. Every cadet who enters it hears the story of what you did there before they ever step onto that floor. Some of them find it inspiring. Some of them find it intimidating, in a way I don't think is entirely fair to place on someone who was just trying to survive a difficult assignment." "I know," I said. "Ethan mentioned it, actually. He said people on his own posting have started treating human engineers a little differently since the assessment result went out. Less like fragile guests who need protecting, more like people worth actually listening to. Is that a good thing?" Hargrove asked, and I understood he was asking honestly, not simply making conversation. I thought about Ethan's voice on that call, months earlier, describing an encounter that had left him quietly humiliated by assumptions nobody had ever properly examined before treating him according to them. I thought about Grace, sitting across from me in a colorful gym half a galaxy away, telling me that belief changes the body faster than any drill ever could, and that the story other species told about humanity mattered as much as any physical training we might undergo to prove that story wrong. I thought about Corveth Zay, 300 years undefeated, sitting quietly in a small dim room, rebuilding a lifetime of certainty because a single result forced him to look more carefully at something he had never fully questioned before. "I think it's a complicated thing," I said finally, "but yes, I think overall it's a good thing, not because we're better than any other species in the compact. We're not. Our reflexes really are slower, on average, than most of the species we share this galaxy with now. But being underestimated for 8 months taught me something I don't think I would have learned any other way, which is that the story a species tells about itself and the story other species tell about it can both be wrong at the same time, right up until someone takes the time to actually test them properly. The story of that single second traveled further than any of us expected, in ways that were not always comfortable. Nathan showed me, several months later, a translated transcript of a debate that had taken place on a compact world I had never visited, where two prominent scholars argued publicly about whether humanity's success in that assessment chamber represented a genuine evolutionary advantage or simply a fortunate accident unlikely to repeat itself under different conditions. I read both sides of that argument carefully, and I found myself agreeing, at least partially, with both of them. It had not been an accident, not in the sense that luck alone produced it. 5 months of deliberate, careful training had produced it, built on Grace's insight and Nathan's data and my own willingness to fail 200 times before succeeding once. But it was also true that a single result, however well earned, could not by itself prove that humanity possessed some permanent, guaranteed edge over species with millions of years of evolutionary refinement behind them. I understood the scholar's caution, even as I understood why it frustrated Grace whenever she read similar arguments in the reports that crossed her desk. They wanted to be either nothing or everything, she told me once, during one of the visits she made back to our original station between her teaching postings across various compact worlds. A fluke, or a permanent hierarchy flipped upside down. Neither one is true. It's a method. Methods can be taught, and methods can also fail if people stop refining them. That's the actual lesson, and it's a lot less exciting than either side of that debate wants it to be. I found, over the following year, that the more interesting changes were not the loud public ones, the formal reclassification, or the scholarly debates, or even the growing list of compact worlds requesting human instructors. The more interesting changes were smaller, quieter, the kind that showed up in individual conversations rather than official reports. Ethan called me, nearly a year after the assessment, describing a moment aboard his own posting where a Kesh engineer, one of the same segmented armed officials who had once treated human technicians with open condescension, had asked him, directly and without any trace of the old dismissiveness, whether he might be willing to explain a particular piece of human-designed equipment that the engineer had been struggling to properly calibrate. "He asked me like I actually knew something worth knowing," Ethan said, and I could hear, even across the distance separating our two postings, that the quiet humiliation from 8 months earlier had finally, genuinely lifted from his voice. Not like he was doing me a favor by pretending to care what I thought, like my answer actually mattered to him. I thought about that call often. More often, honestly, than I thought about the formal committee reports or the scholarly debates that Nathan kept forwarding to my inbox. The reclassification mattered. The training exchange programs mattered. Corvith's public recommendation mattered in ways that shaped policy across an enormous stretch of compact territory. But Ethan's voice on that call, steady and unburdened in a way it had not been 8 months earlier, felt like the truest measure of what that single second in the assessment chamber had actually accomplished. Grace's work with Corvith's own students produced results that surprised even her. 2 of his senior pupils, a Vren warrior named Kestrel, who had trained under Corvith for over a decade, and a younger, quieter being from a species I had never previously encountered, called the Ovanai, both managed to replicate a limited version of the broken rhythm technique within 4 months of dedicated practice, though neither of them could yet summon it as reliably as Grace's original human-trained method allowed. Corvith found this both fascinating and, I think, quietly humbling, a further confirmation that the method itself, once properly understood, could transcend the particular biology that first produced it, even if no other species yet matched the strange evolutionary quirk that had made humans especially suited to discovering it in the first place. "It is a strange feeling," Corvith admitted to me, during one of the last conversations we shared before I formally accepted Hargrove's offer to join his new division, to spend 3 centuries believing myself the foremost expert on combat instinct across an entire galaxy, only to discover that expertise and completeness are not the same thing. I do not regret the discovery, Claire. I want to be clear about that, in case my earlier composure suggested otherwise. I am grateful for it, in the way one is grateful for an uncomfortable truth that arrives at exactly the moment one is finally ready to properly receive it. "You could have handled that discovery badly," I said. "A lot of people, human or otherwise, would have looked for reasons to dismiss what happened instead of studying it properly." "I considered it," he said, with a candor that still occasionally surprised me, even after months of working alongside him. For perhaps the first 10 minutes after you defeated me, some part of my mind searched for an explanation that would allow me to dismiss the result as an anomaly rather than a genuine gap in my understanding. Pride is not unique to your species, Claire. Whatever else your researchers may have concluded about human psychology during their long study of us. I simply decided, in the end, that 300 years of teaching had taught me one thing more valuable than pride, which is that the moment you stop being willing to learn from your own students is the moment you stop deserving to call yourself an instructor at all. I did join Hargrove's new division, eventually, though not immediately, and not before spending several more months working directly with Grace and Nathan, refining the training methods that had made that single second possible in the first place. Corvith Zay remained a frequent presence in our work, no longer an instructor measuring us against a standard he had built alone, but something closer to a genuine colleague, someone who had discovered, at the age of 300 years, that there was still a great deal left for him to learn. I think about that observation chamber often, the countdown light turning green, the weight of a dozen alien species watching, certain they already knew exactly how the next few seconds would unfold. I think about Corveth's amused gold eyes and the confident, mocking generosity in his voice when he offered me 3 full seconds to defeat a being who had never lost in 300 years. I think most of all about the quiet certainty in my own voice when I told him 1 second would be enough, a certainty I had not fully understood myself until the moment it was tested in front of an audience that would never look at humanity the same way again. We were never behind, not really. We were only ever unmeasured, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to build a method that could finally show the rest of the galaxy what had been true about us all along. It took 1 second to prove it. It took 5 months, and a brother's quiet humiliation, and a fencer's careful patience, and 240 repetitions against a rough imitation of an undefeated instructor to make that 1 second possible. I would do every part of it again, without hesitation, if it meant another cadet after me never had to hear the word fragile spoken about their entire species ever again.